Students, this is your presentation on the organism interaction, energy flow, and ecosystem notes. Here's the format that you're going to be using. This is considered Cornell notes, where you put a question or the main idea on the left-hand side over here, and in the right-hand side, you develop all the answers to your questions or main ideas. The thing about Cornell notes is that at the very end, you need to write a summary. So when you take these, and I check to make sure they're finished, you need to make sure you write a couple of summary sentences about what the big ideas are in order to get your full credit. Also, there might be some areas like maybe in parasitism right here where I'm not going to explicitly go over something because it's already written for you, but you may have to add like an example. So follow this format as I go through the presentation and show me the next class period. So when we're looking at, let me get the slideshow going. The big idea about this is symbiosis. When you're talking about ecosystems and energy flow, it's all about the relationship between organisms within an ecosystem. It can be positive relationships, negative relationships, but a lot of what we study in biology are those relationships. So there are different types of symbiosis, relationships. And the first one is parasitism, where one benefits at the expense of another. And I think in your notes we talked about the fly, right? It's an ant decapitating fly. The females lay their eggs in the thorax or the middle section of the ants, and the larvae develop in the head of the ant, developing, devouring that tissue inside the brain. And as the ant dies, the adults emerge after the larva undergoes its metamorphosis. So it's kind of a that example is very graphic and can be kind of neat if you're looking at that relationship, but that would be considered a parasite. What I want you to do in your notes is actually write another example of parasitism. The next is mutualism, where it's a mutual relationship. Both of the organisms benefit. The one example is pollination. Honeybees get their food from plants, the nectar, and in process, the plants are pollinated. Right? And the plants get aid in reproduction. This adds about $15 billion in crop yields per season in the US alone. That's a lot of money thanks to bees. I know in my garden, I try and attract as many bees as possible. Most of the plants that you grow, cucumbers, tomatoes, peppers. I mean, they all squash. They all need pollinators. They flower and they need pollinators. They need things like bees to come and help pollinate the plants. So I try and plant flowers that are going to attract the bees to help pollinate my plants. They're definitely a major benefit to farmers and gardeners all across the world. So in your notes again, I've left a spot. You come up with your own version of mutualism. You can either look it up, or if you know one right off the hand, just go ahead and put that in there. The next relationship is commensalism. It's a relationship where one organism benefits and the other is unaffected. And our example in the notes is the remora fish and the shark. The remora gets a free meal by kind of licking off all the stuff on the shark, and also gets transport from the shark. And the shark is unaffected as the remora does not eat until the shark has finished its meal. So the fish gets food, the shark, nothing happens to it, and life is good. So, excuse me, come up with your own example of commensalism. You can either look it up, or if you know one off the top of your head, go ahead and write that down. Last type of symbiosis, amensalism. Relationship where one organism is harmed and the other is unaffected. It's sort of the opposite of commensalism. And here we have a couple of examples in your notes. So I'm going to flip back to this slide. Okay. And the first thing we look at is competition. Right. Again, one is harmed, one is unaffected, and one we look at competition. And typically, a larger, more powerful organism prevents another organism from accessing the food, shelter, or any other resource. It's not intentional. and doesn't benefit the more powerful organisms. So our example is uh, a beetle and the Spanish ibex. All right, the beetle population decreases, the ibex population increases because they both feed on the same plant in Spain. Antibiosis is another example where an organism secretes, and that word means releases, if you're not sure, a chemical that harms or kills the other organism, but of course itself is unharmed. So I would like it for you to come up with an example of a mentalism, either looking that up or in your own notes, or just know that from prior experience. I'm going to flip through some pictures here. Here's our example of the forward fly, kind of planting its larva inside the brain of the ant. Here's our example of mutualism with the bee. Again, $15 billion in crop production. Here's our example of the fish at the bottom you see there. Kind of feeds off the leftover parts up right there. Feeds off the bottom, or feeds off the, excuse me, the leftovers of shark meals. Doesn't affect the shark at all. And there we have mentalism. You have the beetle, you have the ibex. And again, a study was done to explore, this relationship between the ibex and the beetles. You might often hear the term, and just backing up a bit, beetles are often called weevils, and I know sometimes the SOL likes to throw that word out, so it's just a fancy word for beetle. But the ibex was unaffected by changes in this weevil population, but the weevil population dramatically decreased as the ibex population increased because they were competing for the same food. So this competition, the beetle got left out, the ibex won, and so on. So amensalism. Want to switch gears to energy flow. Last big main idea of uh, ecosystem. And the thing that we have to keep in mind is that everything requires energy to metabolize, to grow, for maintenance, for reproduction, for locomotion. Every living thing needs energy. And if we trace energy source, it all goes back to thing in the sky, the sun. Looking at just some terms that hopefully you recognize: producers, consumers, and decomposers. The producers, these are the photosynthesizers. These are the ones that go through photosynthesis or chemosynthesis, which is turning chemical energy into a different form. But these are our first level of, this is our first trophic level, or they provide food for the first trophic level. These are our plants. These are the ones that convert sunlight into chemical energy. Consumers, right? These are the ones doing the eating. They consume energy and convert the energy that's stored in food into usable energy in the form of glucose. Examples: carnivores, herbivores, omnivores, things like that. Decomposers. Decomposers are the ones that break down dead things or decaying cells for energy. Things like mushrooms. Mushrooms, we often get confused. A lot of people say mushrooms, they look like a plant, they act like a plant, they're a producer. They are what we call autotrophs. Autotroph is a fancy way to say producer, but no, mushrooms are not autotrophs. Mushrooms are heterotrophs. That's a heterotroph is just a fancy word for consumer. They break down dead or decaying matter for energy. So, three types of different organisms. Now let's take a look at how energy flows within the ecosystems. We often represent this energy flow through a food chain or a food web. A food web, which we'll talk about in a minute, but looking at the food chain, the arrow shows, excuse me, the arrow shows energy transfer. All right, that's the key thing to keep in mind. Some people say, oh, we get to see what eats what, and that's true, but really the arrow is just showing the energy is going from the sun here to the grass, from the grass to the grasshopper, from the grasshopper to the shrew. And something to keep in mind is that whenever we have an energy transfer, not 100% of the energy is transferred. So you take the grass here that gets a whole bunch of energy from the sun. That grasshopper that eats the grass is not going to get 100% of the energy from the sun because the grass is going to be using that energy to metabolize, to grow, to develop, to reproduce. So the grasshopper isn't going to be able to get all that energy from the sun. So it's actually called the rule of 10. So you lose about 10% of the energy from level to level. Here's another example of a relationship, a food chain. All right, we're going to move on to food webs. Food webs are just multiple food chains together. Again, the arrows show energy transfer. And this is actually more realistic than the food chain because most organisms have more than just one source of food. So this kind of allows you to see multiple different relationships that make up the entire ecosystem. This is the standard Chesapeake Bay food web that you'll probably see multiple times throughout the course of the year and on the SOL. The last one is the energy pyramid, and this just shows the biomass that's available or the available energy at each trophic level. The trophic levels are just the feeding levels of the ecosystem, and you see there the producers are always at the bottom. Consumers start to pile up, and as you see, there's less energy as you move up the food chain or up the food web or up the energy pyramid because a lot of that energy is not transferred. It's again that rule of 10, where the organism never gets 100% of that energy from the previous organism because let's say phytoplankton uses the sun to go through photosynthesis and uses that energy to develop and reproduce. And as a byproduct of that, it lets off some heat, which means that the small crustaceans that eat the phytoplankton are not going to have 100% of that energy that the phytoplankton got from the sun. So looking in your notes, the big idea, more energy is present at the bottom again. That's where the producers are. And as the energy moves through an ecosystem, it's lost at each step due to heat. And what I'd like you to do at the very end of your notes, there's a summary. So just if you want to get full credit for the notes, just write your two summary sentences and show Mr. Matthews. This concludes the podcast.